second video in my Basics of Colouring video series. Today we're going to be looking at the role of light and dark in shaping your images. This is known as the push and pull of colour. It's a relatively easy theory to understand. Now, if you haven't done so already, do head over to the blog to download and print out some of the sheets that I have available on there, just to help you understand or to be able to practice some of the skills that we talk about along the way. Each of the images on this page just started as an ordinary two-dimensional circle. They were all the same. But by applying light and dark tones in different areas, what I've done is given the impression of 3 dimensions. So the circles start to look like they have depth. This first circle here looks like it's a sphere, like a ball or a planet. Some people see the second image as a spinning disc or perhaps looking down on a sharp point. The third one looks like a bit like a golf ball with rounded depressions in its surface. The fourth one looks a bit like as though someone's pushed their thumb into a piece of clay or something like that. And the last one seems to have a hole right through it like a bead. Now we know, of course, that these images are simply circles on a flat piece of paper, but our eyes and brains are so used to seeing the world in 3 dimensions that we can use some of those tricks to make our circles and therefore the images that we colour appear to have extra dimension, or the extra dimension of depth. Now, aside from its decorative use, colour also allows us to shape objects, which is what the push and pull of colour is all about. Generally speaking, darker colours recede or pull back, while light colours come forward, appearing closer to the viewer. Consider the first circle here on our sheet. It appears to be a sphere because the light section, this section up here, pulls forward, so towards us, while the darkness pushes backwards. By positioning the darkness around the edges of the circle, I've given the impression that the sides and the base are curving away from the viewer in what appears to be a sphere. So let me show you how that one's done. I'm using the same blendy card that we used in the first video tutorial, and all I've done is drawn a couple of circles here on the paper with a pencil. I also have a selection of alcohol markers, and these range from a C8 right down to a C1. You don't have to use every single tone in the sequence, but I'll just do it so that you can see how it's done, and by using all of them you're going to get a much smoother blend. You can skip a couple, sort of go from a C8 to a C6 and still get a lovely blend. So for the first circle here, I'm going to colour the entire thing with my lightest C marker, which is a C1. I'm just going to go all the way around the entire circle. Now what I generally do when I'm colouring is I tend to have the light at the top and off to one side. It's just habit really more than anything else, but what I'm going to do this time, just for the sake of this tutorial, is I'm going to leave the lightest part here in the center, and that's the part that's going to come forward. So that's that push and pull. So I'm going to leave the lightest part there, which means that I'm going to have my darkest areas around the outside of the sphere, and that's going to push away from us. That's the whole idea of that push and pull of color. So I've switched now to the C8. All I'm doing is I'm up on the tip of the marker and I'm going around the outside of the circle that I've drawn. So turn your work as you go, it's a lot easier, so that you can always see the very point of your marker, and then you know where that ink is being laid down. Don't worry if your line isn't even as you're working your way around. It doesn't really matter, because you're going to blend those colors together. So just work your way around, and then what you're going to do is take each consecutive marker and work your way through those numbers. So this is the C7. I'm going over the C8, and I'm also extending a little bit more inside the circle with the C7. So just going around and around. You can see I'm not doing anything special, just laying down those colors. I might speed up the video for you just a little bit so you don't have to sit and watch in real time as I go around and around. So I'll just speed it up from here. Okay, so all I've done is add the lightest area inside that circle here and the darkest area around the outside. Now if I were to do the opposite with this circle here, let's see what will happen. So let's start by, we'll lay down an area of C1. So I'll colour the entire circle with a C1. That just gives me a base to work on. And this time what I'm going to do is start with the darkest colour in the centre of my circle and work out to the light. Alright, so you can see the difference. I've used the same markers, the same circle, but just by applying the darkest colours in a different location, it gives a different sense of what we're looking at. Blending smoothly from light to dark and dark to light allows us to shape objects in a way that's familiar to our eyes and brain, which is what we've been doing just here. An obvious change between light and dark would result in a sort of a jerky looking steps rather than a smooth surface, which is why it's important to practice those transitions we were talking about. You first of all want to decide on the area that you want to appear closest to the viewer, and in my case that's the center of, well, this circle here. I tend to go a little bit more toward the top for most of the things I colour. So that's where I'm going to concentrate my light colours. I tend to concentrate the light toward the top of the image because I think most light sources come from above us, such as the sun or overhead light. And that's just what looks right to me. You have to decide on that for yourself. Because I was going for a spherical shape, I wanted the sides to the sides of the circle to gently push backward. And that's therefore where I concentrated those darker colours. So that smooth transition, or the blend that we were working on between the lightest colour and the darkest colour, is what will give us the curve rather than a step or an edge. Now, work on your blending until you have nice consistent gradients between light and dark, which is what you want. So you can use it in both ways, as I've said earlier. So this looks a little bit more like a ball, whereas this looks kind of like we're looking down into a tunnel or perhaps a hole of some kind. And that's the idea of that push and pull. So this is coming forward, this is pulling forward, and those darker colours are pushing backward. I mentioned light sources as I was colouring. Even though I tend to keep my lightest areas toward the top of my images, I don't get too hung up on that because light comes from all around. There are lots of different sources, unless say you're out under a spotlight. Now, light bounces off surfaces, it bounces off the ceilings. Oftentimes when we're inside, there's multiple sources of light. So you might have a desk lamp or an overhead light, those sorts of things. So don't get too hung up on directionality of the light. I generally tell my students just to forget about the light source and think instead about that push and pull that we were talking about earlier. Now, this technique, the push and pull of colour, works with whatever medium you're using. With pencils, you would reduce the amount of pressure that you're placing on the pencil to get a lighter area. With watercolour, it's pretty much less pigment to get those lighter areas, to make that paint a lot thinner. After spending all that time talking about and demonstrating smooth transitions and blends, what I want to focus on now is actually adding texture and movement to your image. Not everything we colour is going to be beautifully smooth, and in many cases you don't want it to be. Adding texture and movement can bring just as much life as adding dimension to the image. Let's look again at this second circle. As I mentioned earlier, some people actually see a spinning disc, and what they're seeing really is the illusion of movement. That's because of the texture that I left behind in my colouring. Instead of blending well between the different shades of grey, I allowed the tiny strokes to remain visible from my marker. In the first video I spoke about marker control, about practicing with the different marker nibs, which is what we did here. The small strokes when you're colouring in add movement to your image. So to do those, you begin with a little bit more pressure and then you end with less pressure, much like those little petals I showed you. So let me just show you again on this sheet of paper here. what you need to do to get those little colouring strokes in your work. So if you have, say, a circle, what you need to do is start on the tip of your marker with a little bit more pressure and flick off gently so that you get that pointy flicking motion. And then you bring in your next colour over the top, and again you end with that little flick. So you're coming up onto the point of your marker. That is something that is important to practice in order to get that texture into your colouring. So on the tip of your marker, we're flicking. And you can see how that comes out into a nice long tail. When you join those together, that's how you'll get a nice smooth blend as well as some texture in your colouring. So if you leave it like that, you'll get that lovely texture. But if you keep working over and over and over, you're going to get a nice smooth blend with that flicking motion. So keep those little brush strokes and your different tones. You can have an even blend as well as keeping a little bit of texture in the end product, which is what I've done here with this circle. Let's switch to pencils now and talk a little bit more about texture and movement. I want to share an example of a leaf. So leaves have lots of texture with their veins and variegated edges, and they have movement in terms of the directionality of their growth. So they grow outward from the vein or the stem. So let's take advantage of what we know about leaves to colour one with lots of texture and movement. So if I just sketch in a quick leaf, so we'll just have a centre vein and then out around the edges. Just when you're practicing, it doesn't matter if you don't draw the best leaf. Just get something down so that it can give you some practice. Make sure you get that centre vein in, because that's what's going to help us form the shape or the growth direction of the leaf. So the strokes are going to form a V shape with the vein, this centre section here. That's going to be up the centre of the leaf. All right, so all we're going to do is colour that in, following the direction of the leaf. And this is the way that the leaf grows. So it grows in a V shape. As you work your way around, come up to the tip. You can see how now I'm straight up and down. Do that again on the other side. And up onto the tip of the leaf. All right, so you can still see all that texture. Come a little bit beyond where you first did your colouring, or where you first drew that shape of the leaf. Now, come in with the darker green, which is what I've got here, to push the centre of the leaf, so alongside the vein, and make it look as though it's a little bit bent, a bit like an open book. So remember that the darker colour is going to push backwards, and that lighter colour that we've just laid down is going to pull forward. By keeping the light on the edges of the leaf, they'll look like they're coming forward while that centre is pushing backward. So we're going to come in with just those little flicking strokes that I was showing you earlier with the marker, about halfway in the area that you've already coloured. Now we don't want to get rid of all that beautiful texture that we're laying down. We want to keep that in our leaf, because it makes for all that growth pattern. So again, think about your pencil control as we stroke in these shorter lines. And you can see I'm getting shorter and shorter and pressing harder. Now, you'll remember from the first video that it's the amount of pressure that you place on your pencils that give you the intensity of colour. So by pressing a little bit harder now, I'm getting even more of that dark green in there beside that centre vein. Now I'm just stroking in that vein. And then we have beautiful textured leaf. You can keep going with that if you want to. You can go over the pencils with the light green again, and you can keep working until once the surface goes shiny. I find once that surface has gone shiny, the wax sort of will prevent any more colour being laid down. Now when I'm doing a leaf, I like to introduce just a little bit of like a rust coloured brown or a reddish brown. So this is called terracotta, particularly around the edges. So again, I'm not going to colour in a big solid area of colour. I'm going to flick that in following those strokes that we made earlier, because we don't want to lose any of that beautiful texture. And that's what's going to show us that that's a leaf and it has the directional growth and also all that texture. And you can add as much as you like with that. You can even add other colors. You can introduce other colors. If you were doing, say, a whole picture that had multiple flowers and things like that, you would introduce some different colors, reflect some of the lighter colors or reflect some of the colors from the flowers themselves. You can do all sorts of things. Once you get the basics down, you can then learn a lot about reflected light and reflected color and things like that. Aside from thinking about texture, the other thing that you need to consider is the shape of what you're trying to color, which is what we were just talking about with that leaf. When you sit down to start a coloring project, begin by thinking about the shape that you're trying to express. Coloring with the shape of the object instead of against it will give you a great foundation on which to build, and you won't find yourself fighting the image the whole way along. So let's take a look here at this flower, for example. I've just stamped it with a second generation grey water-based ink, and I'm going to use the alcohol inks to colour in the petals. I'm going to show you, first of all, I'm going to start by colouring with the direction that the petal grows, which is out from the centre, so the petals grow out from the middle. And then I'm going to show you colouring across the petal, and you can see the obvious difference between well, first of all, how difficult it is to colour, and then the more natural look that you achieve when you colour with the growth of a particular object. So let's start, we'll go with this petal over here. So I'm going to colour out from the centre. So all I'm doing is bringing my brush marker in the direction that the petal grows. You can also work backwards, so you can work from the outside back in, but it's always that directionality. So it's always along the petal with your markers. Now I said in the first video that I tend to lay down my first lightest colour and then switch into the darkest colour, which is what I'm doing now. So I'm switching to the darkest red that I'm going to use. And again, those flicking strokes that we practiced a little bit earlier, I'm using those. So I'm flicking out from the centre. That's going to give me that texture. And then I'm working through my different reds. I'm only going to use 4. But you can see that I'm following the direction of the petal itself. Now I'm also going to just apply a little bit of the dark here on the edge where there's a little bit of a fold. I won't go too much into the folds and things like that, because it's not about that. It's really about just showing you directionality and texture when you're colouring. All right, so this is following the leaf, following the petal, the growth pattern of the petal. And you can see it wasn't all that difficult to colour that way. And you end up with a really nice petal. Now I'm going to choose another one, so I'm going to choose this one up here, and what I'm going to do, again I've got my R24, is I'm going to go across the petal. So sorry, I'm going to have to concentrate here because I'm not used to colouring this way, but this is across the growth. This is opposite to what you would usually do, and it's a little trickier. All right, we're still going to lay down the colours in the right places. So the dark colour is down here near the centre, and then we're going to work through our colours. Oops. Right through until we get back to the R24. All right, so you can see a difference. Well, I don't know if you can. Let me come a little bit closer. There's a difference in the petals, particularly if you can see them close up. If we follow the growth pattern of the petal or the shape of an object, like we did here when we coloured, you'll get a much better result, a more consistent result, and one that looks correct to your eye, as opposed to going in the opposite direction. Not only is it a lot more difficult to colour that way, but you don't get the same results as if you're colouring in the shape or in the natural shape that you find an object. Well, that just about wraps up our second video for the Basics of Colouring series. I hope you enjoyed today's lesson, and I hope you'll spend some time practicing the skills that we talked about today and even in yesterday's video. It's really important to keep playing and practicing those things until they become second nature almost to you. Now, in our third lesson, we'll be focusing on colour choices, a little bit more blending and mixing of colours, and even some shading and grounding. In the meantime, again, if you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Otherwise, catch up with me over on Facebook or even my blog. Thanks for watching.